Hello, welcome back to Hattie Talks and this week's episode of Turn Back Time Tuesdays. If you've already subscribed, thank you very much. And if you haven't, this is where we talk every Tuesday about a historical figure or a historical event, and it's quite a fun time, so why not subscribe and join the club? Last week we spoke about Lady Jane Grey, and I thought it might be fun this week to talk about her rival, Mary I. 18th of February 1516, Mary was born. She was the only child to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. Her mother had been pregnant before Mary, but had either lost the children during a miscarriage or during infancy. Had one of Catherine's sons survived, who knows what might have happened to English history. Henry may not have strayed to Anne Boleyn, and therefore the Church of England might never have been formed. But Mary was the only surviving child of Henry and Catherine. Mary was said to have reddish hair, pale blue eyes, and a very pale complexion, very similar to both her parents. She was baptised into the Catholic faith at just 3 years old, and a year after that she was named the godmother to her cousin Frances, who you may recognise as Lady Jane Grey's mother. Catherine wanted her daughter to be well educated, and so she learnt French, Spanish, Latin and possibly Greek, as well as dance and music. Henry once boasted, "This girl never cries." He adored his daughter. But he wanted a son. Henry was looking to remarry. He was not happy with the idea of having no sons. There had not been a Queen of England before him, other than the Empress Matilda, who was never crowned in the 12th century, and her reign ended in a civil war. Maybe this is why Mary was never going to be enough for Henry. He wanted the Tudor dynasty to last. He wanted it to make an impression on the English history. He couldn't risk losing it to a civil war. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, but the Pope refused. Henry claimed that his marriage was sinful and unclean because she had been married to his brother, Arthur, who had died. Catherine claimed that the marriage had never been consummated and therefore didn't count. Clearly, the Pope agreed and he refused to annul the marriage. During this time, Mary was having problems with her period. It was often irregular and she struggled with depression, either caused by stress or puberty. She would struggle to keep food down for up to 10 days. Eventually, she was diagnosed with strangulation of the womb. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and in early 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn, his marriage to Anne being valid and his marriage to Catherine being void. This meant Mary was deemed illegitimate. Her title went from Princess Mary to the Lady Mary, with her newborn half-sister Elizabeth taking her place in the line of succession. But she refused to acknowledge her new stepmother, Anne, and her half-sister as Queen and Princess. The relationship between Mary and Henry worsened. He was furious with the disrespect he was showing to his new wife, and they ended up not speaking for 3 years. In 1536, both Mary and her mother, Catherine, were dangerously ill, but Mary was denied permission to go visit her mother dying soon after. Mary was, quite rightly, inconsolable. In the same year, Anne Boleyn was beheaded, and Elizabeth joined her sister in the illegitimate club. Just 2 weeks after his wife had been executed, Henry remarried Jane Seymour. It was Jane who encouraged Mary and Henry make up. Mary did, however, have to sign an agreement that her parents' marriage was invalid and that she would view him as the head of the Church of England. But it did mean that she was welcome back at court. 1 year later, Jane Seymour died during the birth of her son, Edward. Mary was made godmother. Henry finally had a son. During this time, there was a suggestion that Mary would be engaged to the Duke of Cleves, but after the death of Jane Seymour, Henry was looking for another bride, and he just so happened to decide on the Duke's sister, Anne of Cleves. But, as we all know, Henry found her too ugly to ever be his actual wife and mother of his children, and so they divorced, and Anne got quite a good deal out of it. She got lots of land and was able to live her life out happily with her head still intact. I do find it a bit bold that Henry thought that she was too ugly for him. First of all, I don't think anyone's too ugly for anyone, so I'm not being rude, but she was allegedly not that bad, and there must have been other political reasons or personal reasons that he decided to cancel the marriage other than her looks. But anyway, that's for another time. In 1541, Mary's godmother, the Countess of Salisbury, was executed. Her son was allegedly part of a Catholic rebellion, and that condemned her. Warning, this might be a bit graphic for some viewers, so skip ahead 15 seconds-ish if you're not really comfortable with that. So the poor Countess of Salisbury's executioner was allegedly not that great and, quote, literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. So that is disgusting, and I am so glad that we no longer do that. A year later, Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was beheaded as well. Henry was going through wives like there was no tomorrow, and I can't imagine the impact that had on young Mary. She was just seeing mother figures fly by. Her own mother, she hadn't even been able to say goodbye to, and it must have been really hard. It was during his marriage to his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, that his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were restored and returned to the line of succession. As I said last week, though, they remained illegitimate. When Henry died in 1547, Mary inherited estates in Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Mary remained faithful to her faith, Roman Catholicism, and celebrated Mass in her own chapel despite the laws against this. One Christmas reunion in 1550, the 13-year-old now King Edward and his older half-sister Mary had a very public argument about this at court, and both of them ended up crying. Mary refused to back down, as did Edward, both clearly very stubborn like their father. Edward died aged 15, and as we spoke about last week, he changed the line of succession to exclude his two sisters and instead named Lady Jane Grey as his successor. He feared that Mary would restore the Catholic faith to England, which of course she would. Mary rushed to London to see her dying brother, but was warned of a plot to capture her, so instead fled to East Anglia. There she wrote a letter to the Privy Council, ordering them to declare her as queen. The next day, when the letter had arrived in London, Jane had already been declared queen that morning. Mary and her supporters gathered a military force, and Jane's support collapsed. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Mary rode back into London on August the 3rd with her sister, who was now heir to the throne. And Mary was queen. When Mary first took the throne, she said that she wouldn't force anyone into her faith, but just months later, Protestant churchmen were imprisoned. By the end of 1554, the Heresy Acts were revived, and numerous Protestants were executed, and around 800 rich Protestants went into exile. The imprisoned Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was forced to watch two other bishops burned at the stake. He then converted into Catholicism, but it was too late. Mary did not spare his life, and on the day of his burning, he converted back into Protestantism. 283 people were killed, mostly by burning. While this was all going on publicly, Mary also had issues behind the scenes too. Now Queen, Mary needed a husband. Mary was, of course, Catholic, and her heir, her sister Elizabeth, was Protestant. For her country to remain Catholic, she needed to produce an heir, and fast. She was 37 years old. Not saying that you can't have children after 37, it's just that in those days it was different. Her cousin, Charles V, suggested she marries his only son, Prince Philip of Spain. This marriage was unpopular in England. People wanted her to marry an Englishman. This sparked the Watts Rebellion. Remember that rebellion that Lady Jane Grey's father was involved in and eventually led to her beheading? Yeah, that one. That rebellion was actually designed to put Elizabeth on the throne. Wasn't anything to do with Lady Jane Grey. It was just that her father was involved, and that meant that she was a risk. Despite denying her involvement, Elizabeth herself was imprisoned in the Tower of London and then put on house arrest. So Mary was queen and looking to get married, but under English law, when married, a wife's property and titles would pass on to her husbands. In Queen Mary's Marriage Act, Philip was styled the King of England. They would sign official documents together, and the Parliament would be ruled under a joint authority for Mary's lifetime only. Philip wasn't really happy with this, but to be honest, he just wanted to get the marriage over with, and so he agreed. There was not really love in the marriage, it was mainly just political. They married just 2 days after meeting each other and spoke either French, Latin or Spanish because Philip couldn't speak English. So they were married. What's next? Children? 2 months after their wedding, Mary's period stopped and she began experiencing morning sickness and gaining weight. In April 1555, Elizabeth was let out of house arrest and called to court to witness the birth of her niece or nephew. During this time, false rumours flooded Europe, saying that Mary had given birth to a child. A month later, the rumours turned to talk that Mary had never been pregnant to begin with. In July 55, her stomach receded, and it is said to be a false pregnancy, possibly induced by Mary's deep desire to be a mother. Mary was distraught, disgraced, embarrassed. She blamed the false pregnancy as God's sin for her tolerating heretics in her realm. Philip left to command his army against France, and Mary was left in England, and she fell into a deep depression. After Philip's visit in 1557, Mary thought that she was again pregnant. In her will, she added that her husband would rule until her child was old enough. But no baby came. Mary was forced to accept her Protestant sister as her heir. Mary died on the 17th of November 1558, aged 42, possibly of ovarian cysts. Her husband wrote that he felt, quote, reasonable regret for her death, end quote. So not much love there. She had wished to be buried next to her mother, but instead was buried in Westminster Abbey in a tomb that she would later share with her sister. At her funeral, these words were spoke. Quote, she was a king's daughter, she was a king's sister, she was a king's wife. She was a queen, and by the same title, a king also, end quote. So there is the life of Mary Tudor. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I know I said I'd do a happier one this time, but I lied. Anyway, feel free to comment if you have any requests, perhaps a happier one, perhaps a grisly, sad, whatever you want. Please remember to like and subscribe and comment and share and whatever else you feel like you want to do. And please remember to stay safe, social distance, wear a mask. See you next week.